We've heard the name Judge Andrew Beecroft from both sides of the House today, or in the time since I've been in here. And it just happened that I was in Christchurch last Monday, Mr Chairman, and ran into Judge Beecroft, who I'd never met, at the Christchurch airport. And I went up and spoke to him because I'd read in that morning's paper a summary or an account of an address that he'd given the previous evening. And Judge Beecroft talked about, or the article said that he had talked about us having produced a lost generation of valueless children. And I thought, well, that sounds remarkably prescient. So I went up and introduced myself and asked him if he'd been accurately reported, and he said he had. He smiled slightly when I said, well, we're pretty much of a mind then, Judge. He didn't fall about making silly comments like Ms Dalzell would in that circumstance. And he went on to say that we have produced a generation, fortunately only about 1,000 in his estimation, and he would know, of young people with no values, no morals, and no idea of what's right or wrong. That's what 20 or 30 years of the kind of policies that Mr Prasad advocates have got us. And during his contribution, I asked him by way of interjection how many child killers there were in 1974. I'm sure he heard me because I have a loud voice, and he ignored me because there weren't any. That terrible system that he's talking about that pertained at that time, funnily enough, didn't produce Bailey Junior Kururiki, aged 12. And I heard that Bailey's case had been discussed as I came in. Chester Borers was talking. Now, when he was arrested, Mr Chairman, at age 12 and convicted of manslaughter, he was sent to a youth justice facility and given intensive treatment, if you like, for want of a better word. He was given schooling, psychological assistance, counselling, and when he came to be released at age 18, I recall the parole board being quoted as saying that he was now a fine young man with a bright future. And everybody knows, Mr Chairman, that very shortly after his release, he breached parole. And breached parole again and again. Well, no, he wasn't hounded into beating his girlfriend up, Mr Prasad. Now, sadly, and I say sadly very seriously, there is very little doubt that that man, and he's now a man, will reoffend seriously enough to be returned to prison for a long time. And I do feel sad about that, both for him and for his victim. But it's no surprise, Mr Chairman. It's no surprise. I remember seeing his mother interviewed on TV, a dreadful-looking harridan from South Auckland with several other children by different men. She had been facilitated in that lifestyle by the welfareism that Mr Prasad says is a great idea. And that's just the point. That system that he thinks is so good has produced over the last 20 and 30 years a lost generation. Judge Beecroft said it. Judge Beecroft said it himself. I was talking the other day to a policeman in South Auckland who talked about going to houses where 4-year-old children were referring to the police as effing pigs and pig Cs. Now, those children have no hope at all. They will become Bailey Junior Kururiki. How can they not? They've been dragged up with no values, as Judge Beecroft said in his speech in Christchurch, no morals, no idea of what's right or wrong. Until we face up to the fact, the other side is very fond of talking about root causes and drivers of crime and all that stuff, and not just the other side, actually. This bill is the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. It is. And it's necessary because of what we've produced by 20 or 30 years of welfareism. Until we face up to that root cause, Mr Chairman, we're going to have this happening again and again. The 4-year-old children that my policeman acquaintance is talking about, in 10 years' time, they'll be Bailey Junior Kururiki. How can they possibly be any different being dragged up in that environment? Mr Prasad and others over there, Ms Dalzell, talks about the whānau, the family. The whole philosophy that the family's best is what's got us into this mess.
I call Leanne Dalzell.
Mr Chairman, I have to respond to that because I feel that there has been an utter misrepresentation of the position that this side of the House has taken on this bill and why it is such a fundamental change to our Children, Young Persons and Their Families Act 1989, which was world-leading legislation when it was introduced and has been looked at by other countries as a means for trying to get underneath the problems. Now, I can't believe that that member can use language like describing another human being as a harridan and then describing her circumstances. That member doesn't know the circumstances that she was brought up in, nor does he understand the environment that Bailey Kuriki Jr. was born in as well. And I think that it's really unfair to use that one example of a child who was convicted of manslaughter because he was part of a group where he ran the pizza place. He opened the door when Michael Choi arrived. I don't know how much he was led. I don't know how much pressure was put on him to do that. He was 12 years old. He was a child. And what I cannot believe, and that's what I think has been absent from this debate, is the lack of responsibility that the ACT Party is prepared to take for what is a loss, as the member says, of values in our society, where we have children who are brought up who are so utterly and completely damaged that their lives will never, ever fulfil the potential that they might have had the moment that they were born. And I actually am really interested in what we can do across party lines to actually get underneath those drivers of crime. That's why I attended the ministerial meeting on the drivers of crime that was co-hosted by the Honourable Peter Sharples and the Honourable Simon Power. I really enjoyed that day because I was able to sit there and listen and discuss with people who were all there with a common thread, and that was what could we do to intervene earlier in the lives of these young people to ensure that they didn't become the offenders, the horrible offenders that we're dealing with. Well, after I attended that meeting, I was so struck by the passion of everyone in that room that I went back to the Labour caucus and I said, I want us to do something that we don't normally do. I want us to offer to work with the government collaboratively on the underlying drivers of crime. Let's do the 0 to 12. We're not going to agree on 12 and 13. We're not going to agree on boot camps. So we want evidence-based interventions 0 to 12. Let's do that. Did I get a positive response from the government when I made that offer? No. I've been told that the government is prepared to work with us on the Sale of Liquor Act, but not prepared at this stage. Let's just see how we go with the Sale of Liquor Act. And if that works, then maybe we'll sit down and talk to you about what really matters. Well, I can tell you that there isn't one single person working with children in this country that doesn't want both sides of this House to put down the battle lines on the 0 to 12s. They actually want us to work together to come up with the solutions that will address what is a fundamental change in our society, which means that what happened in the 70s or whenever Rajendra Prasad was working as a social worker on the ground, the difference was that we had parents in employment. In the days of Roger Douglas, I know that the number of people working for the railways went from 22,000 to 7,000 over the course of 2 years. If you want to look at the cause of youth suicide, if you want to look at the cause of some of the issues that affected the children in the 90s, you only need to look at the massive redundancies that occurred in the 1980s. So I think that we all have to put aside some of the concerns that we have about protecting certain positions and actually get real here. We are talking about children being given the responsibility of young people who are much older than them and who really haven't had the chance to achieve their full potential in life. And